Hi, I'm Tori, and today I'm going to be reviewing the book Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Woesley. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Ruth Redman. So this is a biography of Jane Austen that came out in 2017, and I was really excited to read it because I love Lucy Woesley's work. She's from England, and her official title is Joint Chief Curator at Historic Royal Palaces. And basically, she gets to have the best job ever. She's always on TV shows where she'll be taking you on a tour of all these old royal palaces and fun historic things. She gets to dress up in historic clothing sometimes and show how strange it is. She writes books about different things, and her job just sounds amazing. I read another book by her called If Walls Could Talk, which was a history of kind of houses and how people have used houses throughout British history, and that was so fascinating. So I was really excited to read this because I love Jane Austen's novels and I don't know very much about her. So one of the first things I learned about Jane Austen from reading this book is that not a lot is known about her life. We have historical records of like the big details, where she lived, who her family members were, things like that, but we don't know a lot about her opinions on things and her opinions on these big life events, because her sister Cassandra destroyed a large portion of their correspondence after Jane Austen's death when she was becoming more famous. And then also, when Jane Austen was becoming famous, it was more into the Victorian era, which was a very proper and prim era. And so all of her descendants and family members were kind of trying to make her sound as sweet and nice as possible, and they were trying to cover up any scandals, or just, like, there was, she had a younger brother who had some mental problems, and he's barely mentioned. He was sent away somewhere, and there are almost no records of that. Very, very few. So, we don't know a lot about Jane Austen just because all of her family didn't really leave that many records of her actual nitty-gritty life. They wanted her to look pristine and polished. And for that reason, I think it would be interesting to read several different biographies of Jane Austen. You know, usually I don't read biographies of people very often, and when I do, one is usually plenty, and I think I'm satisfied. I don't need to read any more about their lives. I know enough now. But this one, because it's so subjective, I feel like I could read biographies of Jane Austen written by many different people, and they would all tell very different stories. So Lucy Woesley was very upfront about how little we know and how much she was guessing, and whenever she made a guess, she kind of laid out the facts that she was using to support that, and she would say, well, because of what she said in this novel, I think that happens, or because of what was common at this time, I think that happens. And she would even talk about several competing theories. Like for the cause of Jane Austen's death is still unknown. She died of some sort of illness, and so it presents several different theories that apparently being a medical historian is a job, which I did not know, and so there are theories by different medical historians, and they present several of those and kind of talk about different possibilities. Another interesting thing about this book was that it was definitely written for a modern audience. So I read it right now just about a year after its publication, so I don't know how well it will age. Right now it was really fun. They would talk about things like, they would be describing the publication processes and say, oh, well, this one is kind of like self-publishing. Oh, and then Jane Austen did something like this, which is kind of the Regency equivalent of crowdfunding. And so they would kind of compare lots of historical things that were happening to modern day life, which was really cool because it made Jane Austen's life feel much less alien and strange and much more relatable and closer to our lives. Now, I would not recommend this book to someone who has never read a Jane Austen novel because information about her novels is woven into this biography very seamlessly. So, Lucy Woesley will be talking about Jane Austen's life and about different people's influences, and she'll mention Cassandra, who she's already told us is Jane Austen's sister, and then she'll mention Marianne Dashwood, who is a character from Sense and Sensibility, and so if you weren't a little familiar with that, it would probably be a little confusing to try to figure out who was a real person and who was a character that Jane Austen wrote. I actually really enjoyed that style, though, because it did create some very interesting parallels. One of the things you can tell Lucy Woesley definitely thought was that Mrs. Bennet, the mother from Pride and Prejudice, was heavily modeled after Jane Austen's own mother, who she was not particularly close to and who she was a bit critical of. And so that was interesting. I'd like to read some other biographies and kind of see if they agree with that standpoint. But you could, based on the evidence that Lucy Woesley provided, you could definitely see those parallels. So she did the same thing with place names too. So she would be talking about places that Jane Austen actually went, and then she would talk about the names of the houses in the Jane Austen's novels, because the houses are very important, not quite characters, but almost, in Jane Austen's novels. So that would be kind of woven in, and she would talk a lot about the inspirations for the different novels. And I was really fascinated to hear Lucy Woesley's opinions about Jane Austen's novels. The book kind of goes from Jane Austen's childhood to her death, and it talks about, you know, all the different places she lived and what novels she is known to have written at different times. Basically, she would write a novel and then bring it out for publication, and so we don't know exactly when her novels were written. It's interesting, Northanger Abbey was the first one she ever tried to publish, and it was published after her death and after several name changes and stuff. And then it's also interesting, there were some novels that she would hold on to and they hadn't been published, and she would kind of update them and go through. So I always just assumed that each novel was set kind of near the time of its publication or near the time of its writing. But Jane Austen would write a novel that was set when she wrote it, and then if it didn't get published for a while, she would go through and kind of update it and make sure that everything was still current and ready for a modern audience at the time of its publication. She also apparently did a very good job with the geography in her books. Whenever she describes where someone lives, apparently that is very accurate to their social station and things like that. So that was really interesting to learn about. Oh, and something I didn't realize I found pretty interesting was that Mansfield Park was published right before Emma, and Mansfield Park is my least favorite Jane Austen novel. I feel like I miss the point of it every time I read it. I just don't understand it. And it's because, like, it has what I consider to be the weakest heroine, and that's kind of why I don't like the book, because the main character seems kind of like a pushover to me. And then the next novel published right after that was Emma, who has definitely the strongest Jane Austen heroine. And so that was really interesting to me, because I'd always kind of assumed that they were set during that they were written at very different points in Jane Austen's life. But no, they were written right together, so she was just showing different kinds of heroines. And it does kind of make me want to give Mansfield Park another chance. Maybe I should kind of try to read it with someone or examine it from a literary perspective, because I definitely miss stuff every time I read that book. I have not enjoyed it, but it made me kind of want to try it again because it was written so close to Emma. I feel like that makes it kind of more interesting. So Lucy Woesley had some very interesting theories about Jane Austen's approach to kind of romance, love, and marriage. And that's like the biggest thing that everyone wants to speculate about with Jane Austen, because her books are so famous for their love stories, and Jane Austen never married. And so this biography does kind of cover all the different men that Jane Austen is known to have had relationships with and is known to have kind of dated or considered, well, I guess she didn't really date back then, but who she is known to have had acquaintances with and possibly a proposal, and there was at least one that she definitely had a proposal from. And it's interesting because in all of these stories, Lucy Woesley takes the view that Jane Austen wasn't really that interested in like the romance of it, and she was very pragmatic and looking at this from a very practical standpoint and almost like a career or a business transaction, which makes sense because that's the only way that women in that time could kind of change their station in life. They couldn't get a career, they couldn't do anything else. Marriage was the only real choice they were making about their lives. But Lucy Woesley argues that Jane Austen's novels aren't even that romantic, and she thinks that the endings of Jane Austen's novels, where there is supposed to be the big romantic proposal, are very clunky, kind of. And I found that fascinating because I love the endings of Jane Austen's novels. And they have this, I've always thought they have this amazing gushy feeling. And like when I'm watching a really good romantic comedy movie, if it's excellent, I'll say that almost felt like reading a Jane Austen novel. And so it's interesting to me that Lucy Woesley has such a different opinion about that, and she thinks that they're not romantic at all. And I can see some of that. In modern movies, we tend to make things a bit more overly romantic. Like in the most recent Pride and Prejudice movie, the proposal happens at sunrise when they meet walking in a field because they both happen to be there. And there's your hands are cold. And, it's this big thing. But in the book, they're out for a walk like they are every day, and he proposes, which isn't as romantic of a setting, but it still feels, it has that feeling to me of, oh my gosh, we've been waiting for this for so long. But it is true that pretty much all of Jane Austen's heroines end up marrying men who make their lives much more financially stable. And Lucy Woesley's biggest argument was that in Mansfield Park, the whole romance happens in the epilogue, which is a big part of the reason I hate that book, because it seems kind of like the whole thing was pointless if you don't even get to see the romance part until the epilogue. But, so I guess it depends if you're holding Mansfield Park as like a main example of Jane Austen's work, or as like a weird anomaly within Jane Austen's work. Oh, one thing I didn't know about Jane Austen is that she was actually engaged for about 12 hours at one point in her life. She had a man propose to her, and she said yes, and then changed her mind and said no the next day. So it was really interesting to hear all about the circumstances of that, and the different kind of guesses about why she would have changed her mind and decided to decline the proposal. So if you've read any of Jane Austen's novels, you'll know that there's always these big convoluted wills, and inheriting money and property is very complicated, and it takes most of the character's focus most of the time. And it turns out Jane Austen's life was very much like that. She was basically, I would say, lower upper class. I would love to read some books about Regency lower class people to compare, because I'm sure that the peasant class had a much, much harder time than Jane Austen did. But she's still, for where she started out very upper class, and so she felt very, very poor all her life, basically, trying to stay in that upper class section when she didn't inherit any money after her father died. She was basically like one of the characters in her novel. She had no money, she had to go stay with relatives and stuff, and it was interesting to hear about all the different females who were in that position. And apparently right during Jane Austen's life there had been a big war, and so men were incredibly scarce, and that was part of the reason there were so many single women running around, and so many women trying to find a husband, and it was so hard to find one because a lot of them had died in the war. And when men are the only way that women can advance themselves in society, that meant that there were basically just a lot of women kind of stranded, running around without many options. And this biography did take a very bleak sort of approach to Jane Austen's life. She never married, which basically meant she never had any status, and she was never able to advance herself or have her own home, really. And this book talked a lot about homes, and how Jane Austen, viewed houses in her books and how important they were. And Lucy Woesley even said that when a Jane Austen character gets engaged, it's almost more like she's getting engaged to the house than the man, which is interesting. I would find it interesting to reread some of Jane Austen's novels with kind of that in mind. But it was, Jane Austen didn't have a home from the time her father died until her death in her mid-40s. And it sounds like she struggled with depression, and that her life was just kind of hard. And so that was interesting for me because, she was upper class, too. The hardships she had were definitely not the same as the hardships that the lower class people would have had, but it still doesn't sound like her life was all that happy. And something I didn't know, she was published in her lifetime, and she sold books and made money from them, but it was never enough money to support herself, and so it was kind of like a hobby that made a little bit of money back and was nice, but she was never super successful in her own lifetime, and it wasn't until after her death that she became famous. And then at the end of her life, she died of kind of a slow, painful illness, so it did make her life sound pretty tragic and unpleasant. So I would definitely recommend this book. It taught me a lot about Jane Austen's life and about her family, and just a lot of little fun, interesting tidbits about Regency life. And so now that I know these things, I can't wait to go reread some of Jane Austen's books and see if I can get any new nuances out of them.